Hello, everyone. Get myself set up here, get my slides. All right, there we go. So I'm so happy to be here on one of the first formal crossover days here at South by Southwest, and we just spent a couple days at South by Southwest EDU. My name is Lynn Jeffrey, and I am from the Institute for the Future, which is a nonprofit education and research organization based in Palo Alto, California. We are almost 60 years old, and I'm going to be joined in a little bit by our friend, colleague, and partner, Dr. Maisha T. Wynn from Stanford. And we're going to be laying out some of the different approaches to building strategy in times of chaos. Now, our executive director of the Institute, Marina Gorbis, created the core of the presentation I'm going to give today, but she was unable to be here unexpectedly, and so I've curated the work to focus on the things that I think are the most relevant for our conversation today. We will be having Q&A at the end, so if you have any questions, please get them lined up. As we just heard, I don't think it's hyperbole to say that we are living in chaotic times. We have a war in the middle of Europe. We have a new war in the middle of the Middle East. I saw in the Wall Street Journal this morning, they said that we are projected to enter the largest disruption of the global world oil markets ever. And also that we should be maybe thinking about drone attacks from Iran in California, where I live. There are a lot of different ways that people deal with this kind of chaotic situation. Some people are even turning these unimaginable events into profit. With the new betting markets, there was a newly created account on the Polymarket betting market that earned about $250,000 by betting correctly on the exact timing of the strikes on Iran. But even someone wrote on social media, we might not even be surprised if dragons started descending at this point. It's a good time to strengthen our ability to think about the future, to get better at being futurists, to find different ways of dealing with the chaos, and to do things with a sense of immediacy. We need to do things with a sense of immediacy right now. And I want to point you, if you haven't taken a look at it and you enjoy reading old books, one of the futurists' kind of favorite books is called Future Shock by Alvin Toffler. It was written in 1968, and it was the first kind of pop culture futures book in the United States. It was written at a time of great turmoil, political, social, and Toffler wrote about that we need more sanctuaries for social imagination. That's what we try to do at the Institute for the Future, and that's what I invite us to do for the next hour or so. Have a place where we can think about the futures that we want to build and how to avoid the ones that we don't want. And Marina and I wrote an article last year about two kind of approaches, two modes of operating simultaneously. If you run an organization, if you run a school, if you're working at an organization, you need to be both improvisational and imaginative at the same time. Improvisation is reacting to things, unimaginable things that come up with immediacy, a new tariff, a new protest, and dealing with the fires that are right in front of you, but imagination to really find the space, make the space, to pick your head up from the noise and think about what the future might look like. Now, we like to use these three kind of principles. I'm going to share this with you for how to approach thinking about the future. And when we say the future at the Institute, we're often thinking about 10 years ahead. So we're thinking about the year 2036. 10 years is just about the right amount of time. It's far enough ahead that a lot of the big things that are playing out today will have shifted significantly. It's not so far ahead that it feels like science fiction. And I think we're also kind of used to thinking of our lives in decades, so it makes sense as a time unit. And I'm going to offer these three ways of thinking about the future, these three principles, in the hopes that these will be useful for you in your work. And then Dr. Wynn and I will be talking about her approach, which is slightly different and builds on it. So hopefully there'll be something for everyone. The first one is looking back. So looking back to look forward, examining the past, understanding how we got here, looking at historical patterns and cycles. And by paying attention to historical patterns, we really can illuminate some of the structural tensions, the big structural tensions that are shaping our world today. And we can scan and sort of start to identify what Marina calls zombie ideas. These are ideas that have been disproven by facts, but they're still around and they refuse to die. And we'll go into an example of a zombie idea in a moment. Once you've kind of understood what's happening structurally in the present and you've identified a zombie idea, it's time to reframe your strategy and imagine the future. And we can do that by scanning for signals of change, which if anyone is doing Foresight work, you know what these are. These are real, surprising things happening today in the world. Could be a new behavior, a new technology. And they're things that give us a little peek into how the future might be really different. So let's look at these three principles and explore the future of education. Now, Marina, when she was at Berkeley, worked with Professor Martin Trau, who's a sociologist at Berkeley, and she uses a model of his to help us think about the changing role and perception of higher education in the United States. And Dr. Trau was doing research in the US, the UK, and Europe. And as we like to say at the Institute, all models are wrong, but some are useful. And we think that Trau's model is useful. It helps us think about the evolution of systems of higher education. And in his work, what he was looking at is the evolution from elite education, where a tiny percentage of the population is getting education. Think of governesses, tutors, private education at home, limited to the ruling class, and it's a very tiny percentage of people who are getting it, to what he calls mass higher education, where he rates it at about 15% of the population. And in this, it gets framed as a right, something that everyone has a right to. You might think about, in the US, the GI Bill that sent hundreds of thousands to college after World War II, making education more affordable and accessible. Or you might think about the state of Massachusetts today, which offers free community college. That's education as a right. And the purpose of education under the mass model is to prepare people with professional and technical skills. Once more than 50% of the population is getting higher ed, that's what Trau calls universal. And so this is when social expectations shift yet again, and society views this type of education, higher education, as necessary, mandatory, really almost an obligation. And really interesting, what Trau's model also looks at is what happens to the perceived value of the degree or higher education as you shift from elite to universal. He says that the intellectual value of the experience doesn't change, but what happens is that higher ed degrees no longer guarantee high status. And so instead, it's the absence of a degree which guarantees lower status. So that may be useful or helpful for us as a way to think about where we're at today. And this is where the US is today. We are, in 1960, about 5% of people over the age of 25 had a bachelor's degree, 5% in 1960. That number is close to 40% today. And when you add in two-year degrees, we're at about 50%. So we're at that universal stage in Trau's model. Now, we see also that higher education is correlated, not caused by, but it's correlated with these positive social outcomes in the United States. You have life expectancy of about 7 years longer for college graduates than high school. The probability of a 20-year marriage, which I guess is an indication of stability, depending on how your marriage is. Could be twice as much for college students as it is for high school grads. Voter turnout, which is a indication of civic participation, higher for college grads. And probability of being incarcerated, almost 5 times lower. So that's some of the historical patterns and Trau's framework that help us think about the future of higher education. And Marisa, let's talk about the zombie idea now. So we've got some of our data, we've framed some of the tensions and the changes in the way education is valued and what value it produces for learners. And so we want to go back to the idea of the zombie idea, an idea that should have been killed by evidence, but refuses to die. One example might be, for example, that crime is an issue of not enough policing. There's a lot of data to suggest that this is not the case, and yet the vast majority of policies around policing are about more money, more funding, and more police. Now, in this case, the zombie idea that we want to explore is that the higher education degree, the one that has become necessary, is a pathway to economic mobility and security. Now, she wants us to examine that narrative, which is a dominant narrative, really, in the higher ed sector. It really structures and organizes all of higher education. If you get a degree, you're going to be more economically secure and make more money. So let's, again, take a look at some of the data that starts to illuminate some of the tensions that call this zombie idea into question. We do see that the number of degrees, of people with higher education degrees, has increased, as we just talked about. That's the purple line at the top. About 40% of people over age 25 in the US have bachelor's degrees. And as I said, 50 if you add the associates. You would expect that if degrees correlated with economic mobility, that overall more people with higher degrees would be working for higher wages. But the green line on the bottom shows us that that is not what's happening. If you look, this is a 60-year time frame here. Wages have actually been pretty stagnant during that time. So this is one data point that starts to question our narrative. And there are others that make us question it even more. This is data from the US Federal Reserve. In 2019, they did a very large study. They conducted research to look at the economic return on higher education degrees. And so what they did was they studied cohorts of graduates of the same age, starting in the decade of the 1930s, going up through the decade of the 1980s. And these were people who got their degrees during that decade. And they compared the difference between someone with and without a college degree. And then they calculated what they call the predicted wealth premium. So how much more wealthy by percentage would you be if you had a degree versus if you didn't? And the two charts that we're looking at here, we see bachelor's degrees on the left and postgraduate degrees on the right. Now, it's important that they're tracking wealth here. This is not income. Wealth is, all of your assets minus your debt. So that is your house, your retirement, your pension if you have it, any equity that you have. Wealth is what gets you through emergencies and contingencies. So we're looking at wealth. It's real economic stability. And so if you graduated, if we look at the chart, in the 1930s with a college degree, with a bachelor's degree, you would have about 250% greater wealth than someone without a degree. For a postgraduate degree, that would have been 400%. And you can see over time this steady decline in the difference between the predicted wealth premium between those with either bachelor's or postgrad disease and those without. If you graduated in the 1980s, you would have a 42% greater amount of wealth than someone without a degree, or 28% for a postgraduate degree, which really doesn't say a lot about postgraduate degrees. It's probably even worse now. And this data here is for non-Hispanic whites. The decline on economic return for a degree is even more dramatic when you look at non-Hispanic blacks. So this is our chart showing the non-Hispanic black population, and you can see that it really declines down to only 6% greater amount of wealth if you got a degree in the 1980s and you're black for a bachelor's versus 8% for a postgrad compared to if you didn't have a degree at all. Now, remember our data on the positive social aspects of higher education. There are many things that are wonderful, positive about higher education. There is more health, there is longevity, there is more stability. And that doesn't even erase the aspects of growing your network, total jobs. So number one, with the highest percentage of total jobs, is home health and personal care aides. This has an annual median survey salary of about $35,000, requires a high school diploma or the equivalent. Number two, fast food and counter workers, about $30,000 annual median salary, no credential required. The next two, general and operations managers and registered nurses, these two make between $93,000 and $100,000, and they do require bachelor's degrees, and then we're back to low-paying service jobs. Now, by the way, there's no reason these jobs need to be low-paying. This is a policy and market issue. We could change the way that we value these, and it may be that in a world of AI, that taking care of people in their homes actually starts to get valued and compensated in the way that it probably should be. So we have this world in which higher education degrees are considered a social necessity. They're correlated with longer life and more stability. And universities and colleges are almost completely focused on degrees as paths to economic mobility and security in an environment of fewer good jobs and a lot more low-paying jobs. And so I think that Marina's point here, if we step back, is that the historical patterns, when you look at them, help bring these structural tensions to light and kind of challenge our dominant narratives. They can do. About how things work and really what higher education is good for. And I think this is a framing that runs counter to a lot of things happening in the higher ed sector today. Now, faced with these types of critical, shifting realities, zombie questions, how do we educate ourselves for the next generation? How do you develop new narratives and strategies to reframe the sector? I'm going to take a look at two processes that we use in the Foresight field. If we want, we can go more deeply into any of these, and Maisha, Dr. Wynn, will also share her approach to this. But of course, looking for signals of change on the edges of the mainstream is a great way to look. It's a great place to start. We use these signals to build visions and narratives based in plausible realities happening today. It's really important to be paying attention to all of the signals happening on the edges of the mainstream. And for those of you in the education sector, you know there is an explosion of experiments happening. You have Scandinavian-style forest schools where nature is seen as the primary classroom. We have new programs like SUNY Buffalo's new Department of AI and Society, which just launched 7 new interdisciplinary AI degrees, like AI and policy. One of our current favorite experiments, a signal of change, is the Rolex College in Dallas. Now, the Rolex College, as they say here, is more selective than Harvard. They have thousands of applicants for a 2-year position to learn how to be a certified Rolex repair person. And you end up going to Switzerland, you learn how to repair Rolexes, you have to get certified in person, and if you make it, you have a pretty steady job because there aren't enough Rolex repair people. So some of these experiments can get us started thinking about what would the world look like if there were more of those kinds of schools, more of those kinds of educational experiences? So what we do with signals is we first of all notice them, we document them, we interpret them, we ask questions about them, we cluster them into different stories and AI, around who the learner wants to be, the kind of life they want to lead in a kind of AI-saturated world. So very quickly, we have the AI-proof university where you go and there is no AI. The whole thing is about resisting AI. It's all real-time human learning and human work. And it starts to get us to think about maybe even an AI-proof economy, a set of markets and services and ways of being and living where people don't want to use AI and they find ways to not do it, to not use it. Then we have the AI-augmented university, where you are learning how to collaborate with AI, kind of world-class collaboration with AI. How do you critically evaluate the outputs of AI? How do you learn to simulate with AI? The third scenario is what we call the AI-adjacent university, also very interesting, I think. This university focuses on, let's get really good at all the things that AI can't do. So let's just focus and double down. What I want to do right now is invite Dr. Maisha T. Wynn, Excellence in Learning Professor. She's the PI at the Futuring for Equity Lab at Stanford, and she's the Faculty Director of the Stanford Accelerator for Learning's Equity and Learning Initiative. So welcome, Maisha.
Thank you so much. It's so great to be here. Lynn, thank you so much for building that foundation on improvisation and imagination. I am going to try to build an arc toward what I'm calling historical signals that build on signals of change. So in 2019, I embarked on a futures journey at the Institute for the Future in Palo Alto, in the heart of Silicon Valley, where Lynn serves as the director of Foresight Essentials. As a participant in their training, I was struck by the fact that I was the lone educator in my cohort. Yet inspired by the out-of-the-box thinking that unfolded as my colleagues from the corporate sector and I learned that futures could be both imagined and designed. When I told people I was participating in a Foresight workshop to engage in futures thinking and world-building strategies, they were often amused as they thought about conjured images of fortune tellers, science fiction fantasies, and apocalyptic climate futures films. However, the future I wanted to explore at the Institute for the Future was not one depicted in science fiction literature or films. I was interested in the educational futures of children from non-dominant communities, and Black children in particular. Like science fiction and fantasy author N.K. Jemisin, I have long been aware of how terrifying it's been to realize that no one thinks my people have a future, and how gratifying to begin spinning futures that I want to see. Science fiction author and Afrofuturism scholar Ytasha Womack notes that those making claims on the future often assert the need for some sort of incredible apocalypse to begin anew. Afrofuturists, according to Womack, acknowledge that some of those apocalyptic things have happened to people already. And in an interview in the docuseries, A Brief History of the Future, Womack asserts that communities on the margins have long had time to think about liberating themselves or claiming their humanity. As I considered the future of Black education, I could trace a historical trajectory of strategy in times of chaos, from enslaved Africans stealing their education when it was legislated away from them and made punishable with violence or death, to newly freed Black people curating classrooms and schools with few material resources during Reconstruction, to Black children being relegated to segregated schools in the South. And of course, desegregation subjected Black children to racism and violence while their Black teachers and principals lost their jobs. Despite obstacles and abhorrent conditions, Black parents, educators, community members continue to dream, imagine, and execute educational futures for children. Their organizing and planning are maps charting the future of education. So what if the future was already here? And what if some of today's most pressing or concerning issues in education have been well addressed through the co-creation and efforts of everyday people with far fewer resources than we have today? I realized that my Futures project at IFTF on Black education had to reach back as much as it reached forward. One of the foundational steps in the Foresight process that Lynn referenced in her talk is scanning for signals of change. Again, signals of change are current and often surprising data points that help us imagine that another future is possible. Another step that she referenced in the Foresight process is looking back to look ahead, or to consider the historical trajectory of any future that we wish to explore. These two steps in the Foresight process led me to conceptualize a new tool for Foresight work, which I am calling historical signals. Historical signals are innovations of the past that may hold implications for future work in or beyond a particular domain. Historical signals reposition innovation as inevitably having historical roots and foundations, never entirely new or untangled. I am an ethnographer by training and a historian by necessity. My interest in the relationship between histories and futures is best characterized by a methodological intervention that I refer to as historiography for the future. I'm keenly interested in the work of Black institution builders of the 1960s and 1970s who dared to imagine and pursue self-determined education for their children and for other people's children against the backdrop of social and political turmoil, overt interpersonal and systemic racism, and severe economic constraint. And it is not lost on me that I'm centering history and archival work in the era of AI. As we consider, share, test ideas to affect change, and to think via AI tools, we should also consider other forms of AI. Chris Chapman, founder of Kingmakers in Oakland, California, reminds us of the importance of AI as in ancestral intelligence. In a letter that he wrote to the Kingmakers community, Chapman reminds stakeholders that they too are in possession of great ideas and potential for innovation. And he writes, in our quest for empowerment and reclamation, we draw upon the profound wisdom encoded within our DNA, the ancestral intelligence that pulses through our veins. Rooted in the enduring legacy of our African ancestors, this reservoir of knowledge, spirit, and soul spans centuries, offering roadmaps for progress and resilience. True enlightenment transcends mere algorithms and computations. Artist Kara Walker offers AI as ancient intelligence. In a stirring exhibition entitled Fortuna and the Immortality Garden Machine, a respite for the weary time traveler, I love that title so much, at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, Walker assembled a haunting collective of automatons dressed in Victorian clothing, engaging with the stages of life, death, and rebirth. If you visited this exhibit, and you still have time, it's there through June 7th, you may have waited for Fortuna, the fortune teller automaton, to dispense a paper fortune to you. Walker has shared in interviews that she first enlisted ChatGPT to create these aphorisms using prompts such as liberation struggles and Afro-pessimism. However, she found the responses to lack the fire and soul she desired, and chose to write 100 plus of them herself, quote, proving that her human sensibility was not yet replaceable. Historiography for the future and my archival research on Black education have taught me the importance of another form of AI, or what Elizabeth Yeakel and Deborah Torres call archival intelligence. While Yeakel and Torres focus on user knowledge in the physical archive, I seek to expand the scope of archival intelligence to not only engage with the historical context for any question asked or future imagined, but for us to become citizen archivists and to document stories and struggles of resilience as we navigate these challenging times. So ancestral intelligence, ancient intelligence, archival intelligence have been at the forefront of my work that invites histories and futures into fresh dialogue. My portal has been a period in the United States known as the Black Arts Movement, typically situated between 1965 and 1975. And in this decade, poets, parents, educators, artists, and creatives effectively and impactfully leveraged their technologies of their time, in that time mostly printing and publishing, to signal to a new generation that dreaming was not enough. They had to be doers and world builders. And together, these everyday people did extraordinary things. Many were young, finishing college, and starting their own families, like the ones in this picture at the Institute of Positive Education in Chicago, Illinois, which was started in 1969. A nation across domains such as education, wellness, and economic prosperity. Futures practitioners will note that some of these elements speak to forecasting. And I would argue that the distinction here is that futuring is more relational, in that it values arriving to the future as a collective with all of our intelligences intact. My research team at the Futuring for Equity Lab at the Stanford Accelerator for Learning's Equity and Learning Initiative, along with the Transformative Justice in Education Center at UC Davis, has been partnering with the Institute for the Future on our Families as Futurists project. Families as Futurists seeks to understand how families from non-dominant communities can take up foresight and futures tools as they imagine and plan for their children's education futures. So imagine getting these tools into the hands of families as they're working with their children to imagine 10, 15, 20 years out for their family education trajectories. We guide families, which include parents, sometimes grandparents, or mentors, along with middle school and high school and even early college students through the futuring process. Many of these families enjoy looking at these historical signals together, seeing that people have done this work and this heavy lift prior to them. Together, these families explore the signals of change and the historical signals of people-led movements for self-determined education. Futurist and an author of Future Shock, Alvin Toffler, is often quoted as saying, the illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who cannot read or write, but those who cannot learn, unlearn, or relearn. Toffler's actual words were, by instructing students how to learn, unlearn, and relearn, a powerful new dimension can be added to education. And if we accept Toffler's invitation, our work is to learn about what came before us and the ways in which people were surviving and thriving prior to the arrival of our ideas. We are not the first to do difficult things in challenging times. Our work is to unlearn that non-dominant communities do not have valuable contributions to future-ready education solutions. In some, these communities have had to be more imaginative, dream bigger, and be more innovative in the face of not having access to mainstream institutions and resources. And our work is to relearn the power of collective work that is tethered to a sense of purpose. As we prepare to be strategic and future-ready in times of chaos, let's remember to look both ways, in front of us for what's to come, and behind us for innovations of the past that have relevant implications for the future. Thank you so much. We're looking forward to having a conversation with you. We're going to talk with each other for a little bit, and then we want you to submit those questions because we want to engage with audience questions. Thank you.
No, they'll do it at the end. Okay, well, thank you so much. I'm thinking right now about AI and memories and the role of memories in education and how AI has memories, but it doesn't have lived memories. So that's kind of a whole interesting direction that your talk just brought me in. I want to talk a little bit about, so you'll be doing a book signing after this. Her book is fantastic, and one of the things that you write about in the book was this independent Black institutions during the Black arts movement period. And I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more about some of the strategies of improvisation and imagination that they actually used that we might learn from as we're in this time of, volatility and.
Yeah, so Featuring Black Lives is historical ethnography, so I put these archival materials in conversation with the people who were there creating them, enacting them, and we're really fortunate because many of these institution builders, they're in their early 80s, they're still doing the work. It's amazing to see them still working on behalf of the next generation of children. They're still fighting, they're still organizing, they're still struggling. And by the way, when I say struggle, they think of the word struggle as a badge of honor. That's actually one of the values. When we say struggle, we say something different in this era of course, self-care and rest. But I think it's really interesting how they lifted up the notion of struggle as a privilege, especially when the struggle was on behalf of the next generation. And so that's been something that I've been trying to reframe in my mind. So distilling some of their lessons, I think one of the biggest ones is they were very keen on reimagining and not reacting, which feels really hard right now, right? And so this idea that we're going to build and create and curate despite a lot of noise that's happening is one of the values that was lifted up. Being intentional about everything, detail-oriented, meticulous with also documenting their work, because if they hadn't documented their stories and the work that they were doing, they couldn't really pass on strategy to the next generation. And I think that's something that, we're all busy doing, but we also need to be busy documenting what we're doing, because how are people going to know what we're doing? And then another value that I think is really important is being realistic about scale. One of the Black arts movement poets, Kalamu Yasalam, out of New Orleans, Louisiana, that one of the co-founders of the Ahidiana Work Study Center, which was an early childhood school in the early 70s, he talks about what he calls an LNL model, local, national, local, starting with your local space, finding out what people need in the local context, expanding that to a national space and even international, and then coming back and curating what you need for the local context again. So a lot of these institution builders were really focused on that local, national, local model. And then I think something that I can't say enough about is the intergenerational and communal spaces, as evidenced by that picture of the Institute of Positive Education, where you have all the teachers and founders. And by the way, I love telling people that the children were not on the laps of their parents. They were on other people's laps, and they were trying to signal that the children are everybody's responsibility, not just their parents, but we are a community, and we are all responsible for all of these babies.
Thank you. Again, you got me with the word struggle. I was just talking to someone in the hallway about the importance of struggle and effort in learning now that we have AI that's making things so easy. And I was recalling Alyssa Liu, the Olympic gold medal winner from Oakland, California, who talks about how much she likes to work hard and to struggle. So that's a nice also kind of thing to follow. So you work on a campus, you're a teacher, you have a lot of students who are struggling, and not in a good way, both in a good way, but also not in a good way.
Usually struggle in the traditional way.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of fear amongst young people, especially now. How are you helping them as a teacher with kind of improvisation and imagination and futuring?
That's a great question, Lynn. So just the day before I flew out to Austin, students who are in my lab, I have a lab called the Futuring for Equity Lab in the Stanford Accelerator for Learning, and we had a date at the special collections in the Green Library at Stanford. And one of my grad students, Estefania, she organized us going because she and I have been working on looking at the Huey P. Newton Foundation papers, which are housed in special collections at Stanford. Huey P. Newton was one of the founders of the Black Panther Party. And so we had 2 tables, Lynn, that had all of the information about the Oakland Community School, which was established in the early 70s by the Black Panther Party. I mean, there's an entire box that has notes written from Erica Huggins to Huey P. Newton about the activities of their schools. You see that they introduce mindfulness and meditation. They were doing, reenactments of the play, The Wiz. And then there was also just regular school business, like kids are sick, half the class is gone, so, everything from the basic to some really innovative ideas. And then what the librarian did for us is she had these other tables set up that were focused on FBI activity around the Black Panther Party and some of the fictitious letters that were drafted in the names of members that were sent out to people to cause dissent and to destroy relationships. And she said, I really want you to see that all of this was happening to them. They were under attack. But this school, they were building, they were planting seeds, they were focused on the children, the next generation. And to have those primary source materials juxtaposed like that in real time for us to touch and hold and read and look through, and to see my students sort of have this aha moment of, okay, yes, all these things were happening and they were aware of all of them, but it didn't stop them from doing this other really important work around imagining what the future could look like for these children. It's a very, very powerful moment.
And yeah, I mean, it links to your point about citizen archiving as a primary practice of learning, but also of creating memory so that people can learn in the future from what we're doing now.
And the documentation.
Yes,
because they
documentation.
documented everything
Exactly.
about their schools, we get to read all of these materials. We get to see in real time what they were doing.
Yeah, and it is, it's one of those, I want to turn to questions now. And there's an interesting kind of big picture question, but one of the things that AI possibly might be good for would be making documentation easier. Now, it's over-documenting, and that's another problem, but there are ways that we can use these new tools that are evolving for these practices that are so important. So I want to take this question, and I'll ask it to you, and then I can give my thoughts as well. And it's, if AI is transforming how knowledge is created and accessed, what should be the primary purpose of education in the next generation?
I love that question. So if I go back to lessons that I'm learning from these institution builders, they really saw education as having 3 pillars. Those pillars were identity, purpose, and direction. Hakeem Adabuti has written about this in his book, From Plan to Planet. Identity, purpose, and direction. And I sort of think about those as identity, past, like who you are, historicizing yourself. Purpose, what are you doing now? Why are you doing it? and direction is really about the future. Where do you want to take this? Where do you want to take this work? And I think those pillars, to me, feel more relevant now. Well, I shouldn't say they feel more relevant. I'm sure they felt very relevant to the folks who created these tools in the late 60s and early 70s, but it feels to me like we could dust those off and repurpose those right now. Identity, purpose, and direction.
So that's what a university or college, community college or high school might imagine, a curriculum designed around identity, purpose, and direction.
Yeah, I think it transcends the lifespan in terms of learners.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's. I mean, I think it's a really important question, whether we're talking about adult learners or people learning inside organizations, professional training, or people in K-12 or college. What is the primary purpose of education? And I was just, again, we do a lot of work at the Institute thinking about the future of universities, thinking about the future of higher education and the future of AI. And one of the things that we're looking at are the different ways that this is playing out in different places. So if you look at, for example, what's happening in China with AI, there's a very different sensibility around and kind of enthusiasm about the technology. And I think that the technology is, I mean, we at the Institute believe that any technology can and will be used for good and for bad. And there are, this is a different kind of technology. There's a sort of, the way it was created has some ethical problems, it has environmental problems. But the enthusiasm that we're seeing in China around figuring out how to use this for education. So hundreds of thousands of parents working with AI at home with their kids. You have a completely different context where you have, many people only have one child in the family. If you only got one child, all of the resources will be going to that child. But there's a kind of openness to experimentation and making the tools valuable and useful for your child, which I think is, I'm not sure whether the conversation in the US is becoming, I think, unfortunately, so polarized. The technology is landing at such a polarized moment in the United States that I'm not sure, actually, how it's going to play out in education in the next generation. I think it should play a role, and AI should be part of education in the next generation, but I think it's going to look very different in different places.
I also think we need to be listening to youth voices on the piece around AI. I think a lot of adults are talking and strategizing without youth in this space. At the Stanford Accelerator for Learning, we just hosted an AI in education convening, and the day before the convening, I hosted something called Youth Powered AI, and we brought students and teachers from all over the country, middle school and high school teachers with their students, to have a day of learning around AI, and we did focus group conversations, and the young people have a lot to say. So something that I thought was very interesting is the young people now feel like they're having to monitor their parents with AI because they feel like their parents don't know fact from fiction. And they're like, no, Mom, that's fake. That's not, you know, what you're looking at is, you shouldn't look at this. So I thought that was really interesting, this sort of youth translating for their parents in this way. I also thought something was really interesting was how students are hoping that their teachers can have AI tools that will free up their time from the minutia so they could spend more time with them in office hours, in more small groups, in one-on-one settings. And they just felt like their teachers are so busy and inundated with paperwork that they need to free up their time. So it's really interesting to hear students really talking about that. They were talking about more of that than how it connected to their actual learning, which is very interesting to me.
Yeah, I mean, it's still, I think we're in such early days with this stuff. So there is, I think, a really important question, not talking about future of education, but talking about foresight as a practice, which is, can you expand on how we translate future building theory into action to reimagine and impact systemic change? And I'm wondering what you think about that, and then I can give my thoughts as well.
Yeah, I think that sometimes people respond to the building of scenarios as like just an act of fiction writing, and certainly it involves a lot of creativity. I always remind people, but we are drawing from signals that are current data points, so we're not sort of just making these scenarios up in our head, we're actually using data. But one of the things that I think is really interesting is that moment when some of those scenarios, and I love the ones that you are building around the different sort of AI universities, I think those are going to be brilliant, is when you put the scenarios in the hands of folks, they see certain pathways and possibilities that they're able to go and pursue. And in the Families as Futurists project, what I love is that we hear back from families who take the scenarios that we've created and they take some element of it and they implement it and create it either at their children's school or for the purpose of their own homeschooling journey or whatever, educational trajectory their child is on. And that to me is the power of the Futures work and the Foresight work, is when people can just even take a little piece of it and build something from that.
Yeah, I love that. I think there are so many ways that Foresight and Futures work is applied and used in so many different contexts. It can be very local, it can be at the family level. There are many national level projects where people are trying to develop participatory national visions of different kinds of scenarios, where they're thinking precisely about the interplay of different elements of a system and trying to play out what's going to happen when we have the shortage of water, of fresh drinking water that we know we're going to have, and really playing that out on a long-term basis. So those can happen at the national level. There's community-based foresight, where communities are using futures thinking tools to push themselves out beyond some of the really tense conversations that are taking place in the present. One of the things that we think futures thinking is good for is saying, all right, let's not focus on what we're arguing about right now. Let's look at what are the things that are going to shape the space and the dynamics of that argument and perhaps change it over the next decade, open up new kinds of points of view. And so I think it's a way of thinking about new ways of acting. Another project or sort of topic that we've been interested in quite a bit is the future of climate action. So we've been looking at what are the changing dynamics of multilateral systems, of financial instruments, and how might new technologies, new values, new political situations open up new kinds of action. So that would be an example of using futures thinking to think about emerging spaces for action. And then I guess my last thought, and then I'm going to ask you, Maisha, if you want to choose the next question. I think we have maybe time for one more. Any vision that has mobilized systemic change is a futures vision. I mean, revolutions are formed out of futures visions. It is a promise, it's an articulation, it's clarity about how the future could be different. So I don't think there's any systemic change that happens without someone having a clear futures vision. Our goal, of course, is to make sure that more people get a voice in that. Yeah.
I might want to sneak in a question for you that I think is related to this question. You are the director of the Foresight Essentials at Institute for the Future, so you are facilitating these workshops. What is changing for you in your own pedagogical practice in terms of how you're supporting different organizations in preparing to be future ready and taking this theory into practice?
Yeah, I mean, I would say starting with the pandemic, that was the first. I've been at the Institute for 25 years this year. It's really crazy. And I think starting with the pandemic was the first time I saw people having to deal with something at such a large scale. I mean, of course, we went through the global economic recession in 2008. We went through the dot-com. I mean, there's been lots of things that we've gone through. It's not like there haven't been crises. But that was a kind of the rapidity of change of that. All of a sudden, all the kids aren't going to school. You know, all of a sudden, you can't go outside. I mean, it just changed so quickly, and it was so radical. I think that was the first real shock that organizations had. And so we had people build up that skill and that muscle of rapid response to really big changes. And I actually think we're stronger now than we were at that point. But the other thing that it did was it hasn't changed that much since then. You know, there's just been so much change happening. I do feel like people are finding it more and more difficult to actually take the time and make the time to think about the long-term future. And some people feel like, why should I even think about the future? Because things are changing so quickly. I have to deal with, you know, this new tariff, or I have to deal with these students who are protesting on campus, and so I think it's actually, even though people have gotten better at responding to really big change in terms of improvisation, I'm not sure that they've gotten better at long-term thinking. And I do feel what we're trying to do with our work is, like everyone else, probably everyone in here is, if you're in the business of, if your work involves creating some kind of information that you are exchanging with others, everything is being speeded up. People want things more quickly. They want things to be, decision-making is being done more quickly. And so we're trying our best to slow people down, to convince and persuade them that, you know, what is the saying? That, you know, it's a time of crisis, it's time to slow down. So that's what I'm really trying to focus on.
I think that connects to this question that will be our last question. What can traditional education systems learn from those models of resilience and innovation? And I think what you are talking about right now in terms of slowing down and really thinking about what we can create is very important. I feel like that is and I think this is hard, right? This is so hard in our schools. I am not, you know, I understand how challenging this is, but also I think this notion of being relevant and being excellent can coexist. So being relational with young people and being human-centered does not necessarily mean you're not also pursuing the academic rigor. I feel like those two things can live side by side, and that's something that I've seen in the historical archives that I think that schools need to take up as well. They don't have to be in opposition of each other. They have to walk together.
Okay, we're at time. Can we have our last slide, please? Two quick announcements. One is that if you are interested in learning more about the scenarios that I talked about, we have a QR code which should be up at some point. And there's a bot, and you can go and explore the scenarios with the bot. There's a video. And secondly, you are about to do a book signing of your fabulous book. Tell us about where that's going to happen and when. And
I think it's happening right now after this at the book section, which I don't know where I am. Maybe that way? Okay.
I
yes,
highly,
they're pointing
highly
over
recommend.
there. I'm going over
really just fascinating history and so inspiring and important for thinking about the future. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.